Good evening. Good tell me so. Good evening, everybody. It is wonderful to see you. We were just saying that if, maybe I shouldn't start with this, if the Mariners had won, we would have had to cancel this because, but I don't know about all of you, but as long as the Dodgers lose, I'm okay as a San Francisco Giants fan. It is really wonderful to be with all of you here this evening, particularly in this moment and particularly with this individual and this organization, J Street. I say this often, and I've believed it and have practiced it for the 35 plus years of my rabbinate, and that is my main concern when it comes to Israel education and advocacy is apathy and ignorance, I think, are the greatest threats, and I want to bring in the whole range of legitimate, thoughtful approaches to Israel and to the American and Israel relationship. And so this is in line with that. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce you to Ilan Goldenberg, who is Senior Vice President and Chief Policy Officer at J Street, a seasoned foreign policy and national security expert with 2 decades of experience advising American leaders on the Middle East, U.S.-Israel relations, in the Israel-Palestinian conflict, and Iran. During the October 7th Hamas attack and the early months of the war in Gaza, he served as special advisor to Vice President Kamala Harris on the Middle East. Subsequently, he became the National Director for Jewish Outreach and Policy Advisor on Harris's 2024 presidential campaign. Ilan previously served at the State Department as part of the small negotiating team supporting Secretary of State John Kerry's initiative to conduct permanent status peace negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians. At the Department of Defense, he was the Iran team chief, advising department leaders on all issues pertaining to Iran's nuclear program and regional behavior. And before I continue, I just want to not only thank J Street for being here, but also some of our co-sponsors, the Kavanagh Cooperative and Congregation Beth Shalom. Ladies and gentlemen, Ilan Goldenberg. So, how does a Washington-based policy wonk and advisor end up at J Street? Tell us a little bit about your background, how you got to where you were, and then eventually how you made that transition to J Street.
Well, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you, Rabbi, for hosting us.
Is your mic on? It's at the top.
All right, I'll do that again. There we go. There we're good. Well, thank you, Rabbi, for hosting us. Really thrilled to be with all of you. Actually, I was saying I was just in Seattle for the first time a couple of months ago with my family for vacation, hiking in Olympic and Mount Rainier. So, my 13 and 17-year-old are jealous that I'm back. But yeah, just a little bit about me and how I ended up here. Starting with the fact that I was actually born in Jerusalem at Mount Scopus. So I like to say, like, right on the Green Line, right in the heart of the conflict. My parents were actually American. They met Camp Tel Yehuda, young Judea kids, and made Aliyah, lived in Israel for 12 years. And that's really what inspired me to ultimately pursue this field and this career. Moved to the United States when I was 8 years old. Was actually writing my college essays about making peace between Israelis and Palestinians 30 years ago. This is on my mind right now because my daughter is writing her college application essays. But 30 years ago, this fall, and it was the same fall that Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. He was just assassinated, actually. The 30-year anniversary is just coming up over the next few days.
Sorry.
I don't think anybody really, truly appreciated at the time, or maybe some people did, what that would mean and how it would really mean the end of an opportunity for peace for really a generation. From there, did a number of different things, and eventually ended up volunteering on the Obama campaign in 2007, working for a guy named Dan Shapiro, who became our ambassador to Israel, and when we won, I was just I was the junior guy helping organize all the Middle East experts who wanted to find ways to contribute to the campaign, and ended up going into the Pentagon, working on Iran for a few years. The Pentagon is the department of what if everything goes wrong. It's a big part of what it does. And so when it came to Iran, that really meant What if we go to war with Iran? How do we prepare for that possibility? What if Israel and Iran go to war? How do we prevent those scenarios? And so that's what I really spent every day of my life thinking about for 3 years, at a time where folks remember we actually did almost end up in a war between Israel and Iran that we actually just saw a few months ago. We can talk more about that later. And then from there, was working, went and actually did that thing I wrote my college essay about, trying to make peace between Israelis and Palestinians at the State Department. Spent a few years out of government, and then was working for Kamala Harris on Middle East issues on October 7th. And in the months after, those were some of the toughest months I've ever had to deal with, especially professionally, but also personally, just how hard things were. And what I at least did was I, very early on in the war, took on the lead on planning for post-conflict Gaza the day after. Because what we understood from very early on, a lot of the things we're talking about today, and we'll talk more about it, are things that even starting in end of October, early November of 2023, 2 years ago, we understood you're going to need if you're just going to go in and fight Hamas and shoot the place up, you're going to play whack-a-mole, but you're never going to really defeat them. This is what we learned from, experiences in Iraq and Vietnam and Afghanistan. You need a plan for actually replacing Hamas with alternative security and governance. And I developed a lot of those ideas. Many of them are now in this 20-point plan that the United States and the president recently put forward. And we started talking to Israelis about them. Officials in the Ministry of Defense, Shabak, elsewhere, they all wanted to work with us on this, but they got orders from up high, from Benjamin Netanyahu and the people around him, like, no, we're not going to plan for this. Because any realistic plan for replacing Hamas involved putting Palestinians in charge of Gaza, other Palestinians in charge of Gaza, and that went directly against Netanyahu and Smotrich and Ben-Gvir's approach of we're not going to have Palestinians control Gaza. And so that became very, very frustrating to me personally. Continuing to do that work into the summer, was pretty tired and burnt out and ready to do other things. Promised my wife it's time to, maybe spend more time with family, make more money. And then Kamala Harris became the presidential nominee. And I ended up getting one of those phone calls, and before I knew it, spending months on a presidential campaign running Jewish outreach, which was literally the exact opposite of all the things I thought I was going to be doing. And not something as a policy guy I ever thought I'd be that deeply involved in politics. But what I found on the campaign that was so important was when you started really talking to American Jews, you started talking to voters, after October 7th, you had this polarization where the loudest voices went really hard in two directions. Those who were, going to support the Israeli government and Bibi Netanyahu no matter what. And on the other side, the people who were protesting on October 8th against Israel. And the reality is, almost everybody I talked to, was in neither of those two camps. They wanted Israel to thrive as a Jewish, democratic, secure state, and they wanted Palestinians to have rights, freedom, security, self-determination. They were horrified by October 7th and the attacks committed by Hamas that was responsible for so much of the misery in Gaza. And they recognized that the humanitarian crisis in Gaza was also the Israeli government's fault and responsibility, and wanted that to end. They were super concerned about anti-Semitism and rising anti-Semitism here in the United States. And at the same time, they didn't want those genuine concerns to be used to pursue an agenda that had a lot more to do with attacking universities and going after free speech than it did with anti-Semitism. And so when the campaign was over, and I took some time to sleep for a few months, I taught my daughter how to drive, which might have actually taken more patience than engaging with
I was going to say that's
Jewish
more
community.
stressful than Middle East peace, I'm sure.
But I accomplished that task and thought about what I wanted to do, and I really decided what I wanted to do was elevate that voice in the middle, elevate the silent majority, and I looked around, and by far the best platform for doing that and playing that role was at J Street, and that's why I've been here now since March. So.
Wonderful. Tell us a little bit, obviously, this is a uniquely opportune time to have this conversation with you. with so many different viewpoints on this across the spectrum. What's your kind of sense of the current moment? The current moment in terms of 3 weeks now since the ceasefire. Thank God, for me, one of the key priorities was bringing the hostages home, redeeming the captive, Pidyon Shvuyim, as we talk about it in Rabbinic Judaism. And in the last few days in particular, there have been some issues, some perceived violations on both sides and some attacks on both sides, but the larger sense of the ceasefire seems to be holding. What's your sense about kind of the current state? What are the pitfalls ahead? What are the possibilities for this to perhaps truly evolve into something more enduring?
Yeah, and no, we are at this, starting with, it's so great that this is where we are now compared to where we were just a few weeks ago. So thank God. And, to have the war end, to have the hostages home, still have the remains of a number of the deceased hostages that need to come home, to have a lot more humanitarian aid going into Gaza, though the situation there is still pretty grim. So this is all good, very good. And also, frankly, it's kind of disorienting. I'm not exactly a huge fan of Donald Trump, neither is J Street on many different issues. We have a lot of disagreements with him, but in this case, I think he and his team handled this very well, and we should just be willing to acknowledge that, right? I mean, you can be concerned about whether his motivations are, and if he wants it because of the Nobel Peace Prize, or whether, doesn't matter. Like, this is a good thing. We should embrace it, and in this case, he did the right thing. So the question now is, where does this go? I do think the overall framework of the ceasefire is going to hold. We're going to have these moments, right? Because Israel's in half of Gaza, Hamas controls the other half. You're going to have friction. You're going to have moments where Israeli soldiers get killed because they're controlling these large chunks of territory that still have Hamas fighters in them, who sometimes are going along with what the Hamas leadership is saying and sometimes aren't. You're going to have Israeli retaliation. I think it's not great, right? But the question is, but it's certainly better than where we were. The question is, now, there's two pathways. One is what's happened before in every single previous Gaza conflict, none of which were nearly this bad, right? But it always is, let's get a deal to end the war, and let's agree on all these other things we're going to do afterwards, and all those other things never happen. And then you have just the moment of where we are right now in perpetuity, which is not a great status quo, right? Israel in half of Gaza, Hamas in the other half of Gaza, humanitarian aid going in, no real rebuilding. That is one pathway. It's also a pathway, I think, where, as Benjamin Netanyahu has talked about, Israel might find itself increasingly isolated internationally because it's not going to...
Sparta nation.
Yes, exactly. Super Sparta, right?
Super
That's
Sparta.
how he talked about it, Sparta nation. That is one pathway, and that might be a pathway that suits Netanyahu and his kind of allies. It's also a pathway that I think suits Hamas, because Hamas gets to stay in power in that pathway. The extremists on both sides, in some ways, playing off each other. But there is an opportunity now for a different pathway, and that is to actually pursue this 20-point plan. And that involves, you're going to need to still replace the basic security and governance in Gaza that currently Hamas provides. So what the plan calls for is, Palestinians on the ground, police force being trained and supported by an international security force that really be Arab-led. At the same time, you'd have to get the governance basically, probably in Egypt. You get all the different Palestinian factions together with all the key international players to essentially hammer out what an interim governance structure might look like in Gaza with a number of technocrats. These are all things, by the way, we were talking and working on, again, in the fall of 2023, and are the right things to do. So I don't have a problem with them. Again, they're all in a 20-point plan. I don't say they're in a 20-point plan. I don't say it to take any credit away from the team that's working on them now. I actually say it to say, like, these are ideas that make sense, and I support them, and good if they can actually implement them. It's going to be incredibly hard. And so you're going to have this interim governing structure that eventually is supposed to lead to elections and a reunified Palestinian Authority over the West Bank and Gaza, and eventually move you from there to what, at least at J Street, we now call it the 23-state solution, which is the Arab states come in, they're working with Israel on what's happening in Gaza, and we need to see some changes in the West Bank too. Eventually, you start to move towards Israel doing a deal with all of the Arab states and creating, being at peace with all of its neighbors, and the creation of a 23rd state, the state of Palestine. So that's the second pathway. It's a much more complicated, hard pathway. We can dive into the details of what that entails. It involves eventually disarming Hamas. It reforms the Palestinian Authority. But what I'll say is, the reason I believe there is hope for this pathway now, maybe more hope than there has been in a long time, is I go back to 1973 as a moment, after the Yom Kippur War, where if you told me 5 years after the Yom Kippur War we would have Camp David in peace with Egypt, that is not something people thought at the time. But what happened? Israelis started to think differently because their sense of security was shaken. The United States started to think differently because you had a global oil embargo, and you also had U.S. and USSR actually getting into very tense, almost second most tense nuclear standoff outside the Cuban Missile Crisis during the Cold War came at the end of the Yom Kippur War. These things, and you had the Egyptians thinking differently. They fundamentally changed the mentality of all the players, and the U.S., starting with Kissinger and then off to Carter, really dove into making peace, while the Israelis and the Palestinians and the Egyptians became more willing to do that.
But one key element to that that seems to be missing now is that the Israelis went through a cheshbon nefesh.
Yes.
They had an inquiry, their leaders took accountability, many of them resigned, and there really was a pretty significant, honest self-assessment that we don't seem to be on the path toward right now.
Right, well, you do have, the things that you have that are the same, and you do have an Israeli public that's, before October 7th, for the last 20 years, we've kind of been in a world of we're going to just manage this conflict because we can just put it aside, we can thrive, we can be startup nation, and we can't deal with the Palestinians, we'll just live our lives. And I think that whole construct blew up on October 7th. Where you do have the Arab states who, before October 7th, were saying, well, maybe we can just forget about the Palestinians. They're now like, no, this is causing all kinds of problems for us. Same with the U.S., the administration that I worked for, where the mentality of many was, let's just do Israel-Saudi normalization. All of those ideas are out the window. Yeah. But you're right, you have elections in Israel next year, right? Probably in the middle of the year, probably around June, but they really could go as late as the fall and could be earlier. But those elections are a vital pivot point moment in all of this.
Absolutely.
And one of the key issues that will be on the agenda is precisely the fact that you have not had. I think the Israeli public still does blame Netanyahu for October 7th. I don't think there's any getting over that, and for the fact that there hasn't been this cheshbon nefesh, there hasn't been this, like we had our own 9/11 commission. Israelis want that, and the polling right now is pretty good for the opposition. But it's complicated. It's not 100% clear. The opposition also is fractured. It might need to involve Arab parties, which is something that's been challenging politically for it to do. So there's very much a world where the opposition wins. There's also a world where you kind of end up in a stalemate, which is, if you remember, a few years ago happened, and you just have multiple elections. But that is a key pivot moment. I kind of see this whole pathway I talked about, where we can eventually get to the 23-state solution. We're in phase one, just get the ceasefire done. Phase two is Trump pushing Netanyahu as much as he possibly can, but it only going so far because it's still Netanyahu. And you're going to need a real different Israeli government. And it doesn't even have to be a far left-wing government or a government that's fully aligned with J Street. It just has to be not this government. Menachem Begin was a Likud prime minister. It's just a sensible realist. And so I think there's, we'll have to wait and see, but I think that there's a huge pivot moment coming in the next couple of years on this that I would hope could start taking us down that path.
I think that's going to have a lot of implications both for Israel and the American Jews and Israel relationship. Talk a little bit about America's role the last 2 years or so. How do you see us getting to the point where President Trump was able to execute on what he wanted to do, and what do you think America's continuing role is going to be? Because I know for decades, there was always this sense that this needs to be a negotiation between the two most directly involved parties, but I think everybody knew that the United States needed to play a significant role. Some administrations were more involved, some less. What's your sense of the American role over the last couple of years, how we got to the point that we're at now, and where you think the American role can be valuable moving forward?
Sure. So we as the United States are the most important player in terms of the negotiation. We're not the only one outside of the parties themselves. And we do it in two ways. One is we provide reassurances and security and assurances to everyone that we're going to be highly involved. And we're going to back Israel's security and things like that to help the Israelis have the confidence to jump. But then also, when necessary, the pressure to say enough is enough, and now is the time. And that's, I think, something that finally did fundamentally change with Trump. Look, the administration I worked in, I worked for Joe Biden. For me personally, right around the end of, right into December of 23 and really January 24, real debates began inside the administration about, what should we do? And how much pressure should we apply to Netanyahu to end the war? And there were those of us who, I wrote about this, I argued as early as December of 23 that Joe Biden, when he was incredibly popular, because the most important piece of leverage an American president has is with an Israeli prime minister is his popularity with the Israeli public. In December of 23, Joe Biden was very popular in Israel. And Bibi Netanyahu was not. And
he sent the battle groups into the Mediterranean.
Yes, he sent the battle groups into the Mediterranean. He was there in the beginning. I 100% supported that. All of us who were working in the White House believed that initial response was the only possible response, and that Israel needed to be able to defend itself, and that any country who was attacked the way Israel was attacked on October 7th was going to respond. And I was 100% behind that. I think by December, a lot of us were starting to question, okay, how much more do you need to do here? Hamas has already been rolled back to a point where it can't do what it did again. And the other thing is, a lot of us, for me personally, working on all that day after planning, I was like, well, if you're not going to listen to us, and you're not going to actually develop this plan that can defeat Hamas, you're going to fight this for 2 years or however long you're going to fight it, and Hamas is still going to be there. So why are we doing this? And why are we and dealing with all the horrible things that are happening in Gaza? I would be able to support it more if I saw a real pathway for actually fundamentally changing Gaza. But I'll get to what Trump has done differently. But I started advocating for is the president should come out and give a speech and publicly pressure Netanyahu and basically say, look, and go directly to the Israeli public and say, you have two choices here. One is you can get the hostages out and end the war and work with the Arab states on a new pathway to integration in the region and work with us on this. But if you're going to do that, you're also going to need to work with the Palestinians. You're going to need to start moving towards the Palestinian state too. Like, you have this option. And the other is you're going to go into a forever war. You're going to find yourself increasingly internationally isolated. You're going to be sending your sons and daughters to fight again and again and again, into Gaza, as reservists, 200, 300, 400 days. And you will still have my support as Joe Biden, but you're also going to do permanent damage to the U.S.-Israel relationship. And I wrote that speech. I wrote a draft of that speech in, again, December of 2023. And there was a real debate in the administration about should he do that or not. I think at the end of the day, the president didn't feel comfortable doing it. He didn't want to confront Netanyahu that publicly. His popularity started to wane, partially because Netanyahu had spent his whole career cultivating a relationship with Donald Trump and the Republican Party and elevating that and targeting and accenting disagreements with Democrats. Really started to systematically disagree with Biden on a whole series of different things and saw Biden's popularity and therefore Biden's leverage in Israel really drop to the point where he couldn't do that anymore. But then when Trump came in, we did get this ceasefire in January. And Trump was just incredibly popular with Netanyahu's base, with Netanyahu's strongest supporters. So in March, when this all fell apart, like Donald Trump could have done exactly what he did in September and March. And he basically chose not to do it at the time, and for 6 months, we had essentially a green light to keep doing what was going on until we had these strikes in Doha about a month ago, and the Arab states, a number of the Gulf states went to president and were like, this is crazy. This has just gotten out of control. We're now in broad daylight, you have strikes taking place in the middle of downtown Doha. And for whatever reason, that's what seemed to have really flipped the switch in the White House. And you can argue, part of it is also the deep ties that Trump administration, that Trump family, there's a lot of money involved there. It's a problem. But in this case, again, it worked out in a good direction of him applying the necessary pressure. And it's you don't have to look at me. Jared Kushner, right, whose quote was being interviewed on 60 Minutes and basically said, the president decided the Israelis had gotten a little out of control and they were doing things that were not in their best long-term interests, and he's going to have to be very strong and clamp down and tell them not to do it. And that's what happened. And so that kind of tells you about the leverage that Donald Trump in particular has with Netanyahu.
Yeah. Without going too far inside baseball here, one thing that I know is of concern to some folks is President Trump's reliance on the Turks and the Qataris as significant dominant players here when they have been supporters of Hamas and enablers of Hamas throughout. Is there a concern that there's that the president is looking to them to play such a significant role?
It's especially complicated with the Turks. But you don't make peace with your enemies, right? You have to,
with your friends, you do with your enemies.
You have to negotiate with your enemies. And the reality of Qatar in particular, this is really important to understand with Qatar. Qatar for years had this approach of talking to everybody, which actually can be very useful to the United States at different points. Whether it's they hosted the Taliban for negotiations between the U.S. and as the U.S. was getting out of Afghanistan, or whether it's the role they've played with Hamas. It's also important to remember that there was a deal struck in 2017 between Israel and Hamas and Qatar, where every month Qatar was flying millions of dollars of cash into Ben Gurion Airport that was then being escorted by armored car into Gaza to keep the peace. Netanyahu had a strategy. The strategy was, if Hamas is strong and paid off, and the Palestinian Authority is weak, and the Palestinians are divided, there's nobody to negotiate with. And then there can be no two-state solution and no problem for me to have to deal with. So he was literally, Palestinian Authority, and we can talk about it, has corruption challenges, needs new leadership, is anti-democratic, problematic in many ways. Still much more moderate than Hamas, generally against violence. For years, the strategy was to defund them while empowering Hamas. But again, it's the extremists on the Israeli side playing together with the extremists on the Palestinian side to reinforce each other, as opposed to the 90s. People I worked with who were part of those negotiations in the 90s between Arafat and Rabin, and used to talk about how they worked together. They were working together against the extremists. Rabin would say to Arafat, I'm going to do this for my people, and this might be politically hard for you, but I understand you're going to need to. They would actually coordinate these things so that they could each be credible and speak to their own populations, while at the same time strengthening their own hands to work together for peace. And we've got the exact opposite going on now. So my biggest problem I have with the Qatar situation is not Qatar, it's what came before it. But
let's talk a little bit domestically.
Yeah.
Obviously, the post-October 7th world has had a significant impact on American electoral politics. I think it was a factor in Kamala Harris's defeat and President Trump's victory. How do you think it is going to impact the midterms next year and perhaps the presidential election 2028?
So, look, I don't think that this was the driving issue that led to Kamala Harris losing the election. I think it had a lot more to do with with the economy and inflation and actually ways Donald Trump was hitting specific voters that, but it certainly didn't help, right? And you had this real divide inside the Democratic Party because you had this kind of polarization and extremes. And so one of the things we've been trying to do at J Street is really be that voice to try to unify the Democratic Party with that big fat middle of the American Jewish community. We like to say we target, we're trying to go for the 50-yard line of the American Jewish community and 50-yard line usually, which oftentimes correlates with the 50-yard line of the Democratic Party because, Jews do vote 70% for Democrats. Even though our movement actually is the 30-yard line to the 30-yard line. We're trying to be pretty inclusive and expansive. And so a lot of what the messages that I think will work and that can unify the party, partially is actually, the more successful Donald Trump is in actually implementing this 20-point plan and the better things get, not only will the world get better there, but I actually think the electoral stakes associated with this issue will go down. And so we can have arguments over other things like democracy and healthcare and, frankly, things that I think Democrats would rather argue about. So I'm not only do I support Donald Trump making progress on this because I think it'll be good for Israelis and Palestinians in the world and it's the right thing to do, but actually it'll be good for politics too in this country. I do. The other thing I'll say about this is, in terms of politics, it's also really affected American Jews. Maybe that's the other piece of this, right? And how hard it has been. I mean, it's just been a brutal couple of years for American Jews, I feel, since October 7th. And the word I often use is lonely. All these institutions American Jews have been used to relying on,
And alliances.
Yeah, and alliances. It's, the American government who we're used to relying on for safety and security. And now we have anti-Semitism being used as an excuse and a cudgel to do all kinds of things we disagree with in our name. The Israeli government, who are most American Jews at this point, over 70% disapprove of Netanyahu. Our own progressive allies, that's been part of it too, who after October 7th, you did not see the kind of sympathy and camaraderie and understanding of Jewish pain.
I would go even further, and I think a lot of us who have been toiling in those vineyards felt utterly betrayed by a lot of the folks for whom we stood by when they needed us, and they abandoned us in our moment of need for support.
I think it felt very much like that for a lot of American Jews, and I felt that in myself especially, I didn't really fully appreciate that working at the White House because I was so focused on what was going on over there. But when I got on, the campaign, and really started working with, American Jewish community every day and understanding how traumatized it was by this whole experience, I go back to one very specific experience I had early in the campaign, where we started suggesting, let's do big Jewish events with Doug Imhoff, the second gentleman who I ended up doing a lot of work with, the first Jewish principal who had a position in the White House. And people were enthusiastic, and then we would ask, okay, the state teams in places like Pennsylvania and Michigan, okay, we want to do this. And the first responses back were, well, what about a small, instead of 300 people doing a big get out the vote event, why don't we do a small breakfast? It's a little weird. You start to poke, why, what's going on here? And you kind of realize people were worried about protests, or they were worried about, well, this is going to be a big event with a bunch of people waving Israeli flags and talking about Gaza. And we're like, no. We are American Jews who are excited to vote for a Democratic candidate, guys. And once you explained it to people, you could break through that. But also, one of the benefits of having, a Jewish outreach director who had very close ties to the nominee and to her whole team, because I knew her, was the ability to just cut through all that and go right to the very top and get complete support from people like Doug Emhoff and Kamala Harris, who understood, no, that's ridiculous. And then we did all the events, but we had to kind of cut through all this. I don't know, some of it I think was anti-Semitism, but some of it is also just what's the word I'm looking for? bias, right? Or latent bias, unintended bias, but real bias, and things that American Jews had to deal with after October 7th and still have to deal with. You also have the challenge, I should say, from the right at the same time, with the spike in anti-Semitism and the things the Trump administration is doing. I spent a lot of time in Pittsburgh with the Tree of Life community. It's a key, and seeing the consequences of what that can also bring. And the other part of the loneliness has also been a lot of traditional leading Jewish organizations who've kind of bent the knee in this area. And are not standing up for civil rights and the way we've traditionally done it, and instead are just kowtowing to Trump or supporting Netanyahu no matter what. And so again, it's all of that. Like, these are all different things we as American Jews count on. Progressive allies, Jewish organizations, American government, Israeli government, all not being there for us the way we're used to being there for us.
Yeah. So listen, I'd like to open it up for some questions, but as I say to every group of Jews, questions are not soliloquies. Questions are not monologues. We don't need a 5-minute qualifier. If you could try to keep it so we can get as many people as possible, if we can try to keep it focused on the actual question and not the qualification, that would be greatly appreciated. Adam has a microphone over there because we have. Ann, do you want to come up just so we can hear you in the mic? Thanks.
Make sure it's on?
Yep.
First of all, thank you. Whoa, that was loud. For all of this, it's been great. In regards to the day after, I just have a couple questions about education, and if that was part of kind of those day after plans, both within Gaza, Palestine, and within Israel. One of the things that I've studied is the difference between, Jewish and Arab schools and how there's not really a concrete structure. So speak to that, please.
Sure. I think you do need fundamental changes in education in both societies, right? As pointing at Palestinian textbooks, which is a real problem and has been a real problem. You have to have changes and reforms to those systems. You've also got a lot of Israeli textbooks that also don't show any kind of West Bank or Gaza either, right? So it really is mutual. Like, if you're going to talk about from the river to the sea, there's two sides who are oftentimes saying from the river to the sea, not just one. And you need change and reform in education in both those systems. Both of those are long-term. You have to be doing both things at once. Like, I'm a policy nerd, so like and a national security guy, so my bias always goes towards the immediate. If you're trying to have a day after where eventually you replace Hamas and get it to disarm, has to start with basic security and governance. And so less in the immediate education than those things. But especially as I've gone on, and especially with my role in J Street, we take delegations to Israel all the time. I go to Israel and the Palestinian territories a couple times a year at least, and we try to spend equal time in both, and seeing a lot of people who are doing this kind of education and cross people to people, and just very brave and impressive people on both sides doing this. It does inspire the fact that we need to be building both those ties together as well. My general bias, again, as a longtime foreign policy guy, is always, well, if you get the leaders first, it becomes easier for the societies to then do more of the truth and reconciliation that comes after a deal. But these two things have to go hand in hand and in parallel, and they help each other. So that's at least how I think about it.
Wonderful. Barbara, do you want to come up and... If you want to come forward for the next, just right after her, say it on first.
So welcome, Ilan. So my question to you, as you were gaming out, the master plan, and you were putting together what if this could really work, who were the leaders on the Palestinian side and the leaders on, the Israeli side, and what was your dream team? Is Mustafa Barghouti part of it? And that's my first question. And the other question is, how did you game out the China, Turk, Russia alignment in that equation of going forward with the 23-state plan?
Sure. So on the Palestinian side, we didn't really look as much at like who an individual leader might be, but we did a lot of work on who could govern Gaza. And the thing that's interesting on the Palestinian side is before the war, I mean, there are a lot of ministries, health ministry, water ministry, municipalities, mayors. Most of these people, not Hamas. Some people at the very top Hamas, and certainly the people who had the guns and were doing the security were Hamas. But a lot of these ministries were run, not all that differently than an American cabinet agency, for example, where 98% of the people in jobs are long-time career technical civil servants, and then you have a few political leaders at the top who are Hamas. So a lot of that brain capacity in those legitimate people who are seen as legitimate in the eyes of the population are now sitting in Cairo. And so putting a group together, again, and I think you have to be realistic about this group. Hamas is not going to be part of this. Hamas has been okay not being part of this. They've actually said, we don't need to do the governing anymore. Like, what Hamas wants to do is essentially, they want the Hezbollah model. They want to be able to just peel back, recover, build up their weapons, let other people govern. And I think what you have to do is, well, this can be a different scenario because, A, in Lebanon, you just had Iran sending a lot of weapons. It was very easy to do. The borders were uncontrolled. You could just fly stuff into Syria. Here, the borders are controlled, so they can't disarm. They think they're going to win this game, but then actually you build a better alternative governance and security structures, and over time, Hamas goes away. Or basically is in such a weakened position, then they have to agree to things like disarming. So that's why they agreed to it. The Israelis agreed to it, and the international community agrees to it because they think they can build this alternative. On the Israeli side, look, I mean, the best person out there right now is Yair Golan, who's the head of the Democrats. This is what used to be, basically the Israeli left. Former IDF deputy chief of staff on October 7th, grabbed his gun, drove south, and rescued a bunch of people. But it's going to be a coalition, so it's also going to involve people like Naftali Bennett and Avigdor Lieberman, who are more right-wing, who I'd kind of call never Netanyahus at this point, right? They're much more reasonable and decent people than some of the people in the current government. But it's going to be hard. It's going to some combination of those in government. So it's going to be tough going. But that's so Salam, he's incredibly effective, and we need the next Salam. We don't need, I think he's in his 70s at this point, and one of the reasons he was so effective is because actually he was dealing with an international community that was putting a lot of money in, and he was a good manager. The international community has stopped putting money in because they've gotten just sick of the whole thing. That's restarted in the last year, so I think you have more promise there. Marwan Barghouti, who is in jail right now, seen by many as a potentially unifying figure.
Didn't Trump just suggest that maybe he should be released?
Yeah. I mean, there's been a lot of talk. Yeah. But it's really interesting how Netanyahu was happy to allow for 250 hardened, Hamas murderers. Yeah. But this one guy who, also was responsible, not directly, but did order the murder of Israelis, which is why he's in jail. Sure. But this one guy absolutely cannot go, and Netanyahu insists on not, which again goes to I don't want to set up an alternative that I might actually have to negotiate with. But a lot of people, compare him to the closest thing you might have to a Mandela figure in the Palestinian polity. I don't know if that's accurate or true. Nobody really does. He's been in jail for 20 years, right? That's one possibility. But we have to see. The one thing I will say on the Palestinian side is, I go to Palestine every time I, come to Israel, and you go to Ramallah, and you do these meetings with, private sector and community leaders and activists and people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, and they are incredibly smart and incredibly dynamic, and they are the next generation of leaders. Then you go to the Muqata, the Palestinian, presidential palace, and you sit down with a bunch of all men, so start with that as opposed to a much more diverse group, all smoking lots of cigarettes, all in their like 80s. And he's just like, guys, like this is depressing. You
Yeah.
need to step aside, and there is the potential here.
Yeah.
So.
Please.
Thank you, and thank you for being here. I have a question to follow up on a comment that you made recently on the J Street podcast. I thought your dialogue with Yehuda Kurtzer was like fascinating. Listened to it more than once.
Yeah.
In particular, you explained a few times that you felt there would be certain conditions, if you will, on the makeup of the next Israeli government and sort of what that would mean for your Zionism. And the way that you described it is you described it as post-Zionism and aligned with Peter Beinart's views of a single state between the river and the sea. And, you know, Yehuda challenged you a bit and said, you know, what's that conditionality about? And the whole conversation kind of trailed. So I'm curious if you could explain more how you think about that. You know, what is post-Zionism for you? And how does that play into J Street's policy agenda?
Sure. So I very much identify as a liberal Zionist, and I believe in, you know, Israel as a Jewish democratic state. Like that is still absolutely what I believe. The conversation I was having with Yehuda was, actually we were having this conversation earlier today. What happens if after all of this, Netanyahu wins next year? Like, you know, like what happens? That was the context of the conversation. What happens if after all this, and what is going to happen? What are American Jews going to do? I think there's a lot of American Jews who, at this point, you know, see what Netanyahu has done, but they also see 75% of the Israeli public standing up and protesting and saying we want the hostages out and the war to end, and don't necessarily see him as representing where the Israeli public wants to go. But if actually they re-elect him and Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, then like, what does that mean for the U.S.-Israel relationship? So with Yehuda, I was just kind of opining for a moment, and I think he like took me on a little bit of a trail. I'm not, you know, I don't know exactly how I would react, and like what I would think, and what would be the right place to go. And I think J Street would have to wrestle with that too. If after all this, Netanyahu wins. Because if after all this Netanyahu wins, the Israeli public is basically saying, we're okay with this, right? Israel does face this pathway, right? This choice of either, you know, the Israeli public has realized that managing the conflict isn't going to work. That, like, just, that's what I think that's coming true. Now you look at the Israeli public and you poll the Israeli public, and you can ask them, do you want to just kick all the Palestinians out of Gaza? Would you support that plan? And you get 75%. Now you also can poll them and say, U.S. puts down a plan, we get basically, you poll them and give them a scenario very similar to the positive one I described, that also gets 75%. Which to me says it's a society in flux, starting to wrestle and think about where they really want to go. They're not really sure. They know they don't want to be where they are right now. And so I'm really going to push for that better outcome. I don't know, like I've been thinking about the conversation with Yehuda. I don't know where I would end up if after all this Netanyahu. I'm not sure that I don't think I would be in post-Zionism. Like I don't. I still think that I'd keep fighting for a Jewish democratic state. He put a few words in my mouth in that conversation. But at the same time, like I would have to reevaluate fundamentally my relationship and whether I would be more supportive of, you know, of taking just the U.S. having to put even more pressure on Israel and what kind of steps. So that's kind of, I think, like where I am, but I would rather not think as much about that scenario as work to support the alternative scenario that we don't have to worry about that.
I agree. Steve, please.
Thank you for being here. And I was hoping if you might go back a little bit and tell us why October 7th happened in the first place, what the festering things were, and why Israel conducted the war the way they did. Does the world understand the way Hamas fights and the way Israeli fight back, and how did that all happen?
Sure. All right, it's a lot, so let me, I'll try to do it
In 4 minutes, please. Yes.
Exactly. Efficient kind of way. So I think what we had was, after the Second Intifada, we had 20 years of Israel essentially just deciding we don't have a partner on the other side. We can't deal with the Palestinians, so we're just going to put that all aside. We're going to focus on other things. We're going to be startup nations. We're going to have an incredible, thriving society. We're going to be so successful. And we're just not going to worry about this. But also, again, Netanyahu coming in and actually being like, the way to manage it is to basically pay Hamas off and that they won't bother us. And we're going to empower them, and we're going to just create a scenario. And I've barely talked at all about the West Bank. We're also just going to continue to build settlements in the West Bank and get much more aggressive on things like that. And we're going to be able to do all that. We're going to make peace with the Arabs, and people are just going to forget about the Palestinians. And that, I think, ultimately, that scenario created a situation that led to this explosion, which I think a lot of people, if you talk to historians, you look at, repressed societies sometimes, kind of lash out in these incredibly violent and incredibly unacceptable ways. But you even look at things like going back to slave revolts in the United States. You had moments of just really gruesome violence and these unacceptable lashes out. So I think those are some of the societal dynamics that created the environment in which this happened. I also think Israelis had so grown beyond thinking that the Palestinians could threaten them. They were focused. Israel, such an incredibly vibrant and successful society, able to knock missiles coming from Iran thousands of miles away and into the atmosphere. Basically going into the atmosphere, right? And at the same time, they couldn't stop a bunch of guys on gliders from coming in to southern Israel and killing 1,200 people. It's because they'd almost forgotten about the Palestinians. They'd also moved a lot of their forces off of the Gaza border and put them into the West Bank in order to basically, because you had a lot of challenges in the West Bank, but also supporting a lot of that were coming as a result of increased settlements that were then causing increased friction in the West Bank, which created a vulnerability. And so all these things together.
And the judicial coup, which drove the whole country apart.
Yes, drove
for
the whole country
10
apart
months.
and signaled to created, you've seen intelligence since, convinced Hamas, convinced Iran, convinced Hezbollah, others, Israel is about to go into civil war, we're going to take advantage of this moment. All those things played together to create this environment. But at the end of the day, it's the biggest issue of all. It's the Palestinians, right?
Let's get one or two more. David, please. Sure.
Yes, it sounded to me, and maybe I'm wrong about that you were a bit optimistic about the next phase of the 20 points. And I'm curious about that, particularly in light of the fact that Hamas is not easily going to give up its arms. Yeah. That's one side. But the more dangerous side, I guess, is the Israeli side. Considering that you still have Smotrich and Ben-Gvir there, and the fact that there is hardening of the Israeli public opinion towards the right. And so I'm not sure to what extent that second part could be really accomplished.
Yeah, so I still think the most realistic scenario, unfortunately, is the kind of perpetuation of the status quo, right? But I do think there is this opening because of the things I've talked about, right? The Arabs being much more engaged in pushing forward, the US, and also Israeli society, I think, still wrestling with where exactly they go. And so I would say the two things you talked about. In terms of Hamas disarming, I think that needs to come near the end of this process. You weaken Hamas first by putting in place this alternative security mechanism, the international force and Palestinian takeover, the Palestinian governance. Hamas allows it to happen because they are so weak and because they think they can weather it. And we have to make sure that the whole world works together to actually use that moment to further weaken them, and kind of like boiling a frog, right? You slowly the water heats up, and they find themselves just with no more power, and then they have no choice but to disarm. As for Israel, I think, again, yes, you have elections next year. I think Donald Trump has a lot of leverage on Netanyahu because of how popular he is politically and his threat to kind of break with Netanyahu.
He's the real prime minister of Israel
Yeah,
right now.
he's got so much. I mean, I was just very jealous as a Biden administration official looking at Trump telling Netanyahu to do things that if we had ever told him to do would have caused news stories all over the Israeli press about how anti-Israel Joe Biden is for telling Bibi Netanyahu to do all kinds of things that Donald Trump is telling Netanyahu to do that Netanyahu is just doing right now. So that will only go so far when it really comes to the core of it. So that's why I go back to phase 1, ceasefire. Phase 2 is the next year where apply as much pressure as possible to move as much as possible, right, recognizing it's going to be slow and rough with Netanyahu. And then elections, hopefully new leadership, and then you can accelerate and move much more quickly down this pathway of something that's going to be ugly and messy and take years. This whole plan for Gaza, not to mention, again, like which I haven't, and I want to just talk about it for a minute because I have not talked about it yet, just what is happening in the West Bank, where you've got this boom of settlements, and a lot of these small caravans get set up very quickly, connected to water, connected to electricity. Then these guys going out doing a lot of violent things. They basically go out, it's systemic, right? Israeli military, most of the active Israeli military is off fighting in Gaza, or has been. So who are the reservists who are responsible for the West Bank? It's mostly local settler units. So their command is to defend Israelis, not Palestinians. So these guys go out to kick Palestinians out of their home and violently attack them. The military goes with them. The military stands aside. It does not attack the Palestinians. When the Palestinians start fighting back, the military attacks the Palestinians to defend the Israelis. That's systemic. That's been happening. It's why the Biden administration put sanctions on a bunch of these bad actors. They were removed by Trump, but now we have at least legislation that J Street's supporting that has 100 members of Congress behind it. It was actually sponsored, one of the people who sponsored it, the lead sponsors who started this legislation was Adam Smith, together with Jim Himes, the ranking member on intelligence, and Jerry Nadler, one of the most important Jewish leaders in Congress. This is a really terrible thing that's also happening that we can't forget about. We spend so much time on the horrors of Gaza, but we have to remember with the West Bank too.
How about last question, Yevgeny, please.
Well, thank you for sharing your time and your insight. You talked a bit about this isn't the first American president involved in trying to broker peace in the Middle East, and Donald Trump, you outlined, is kind of uniquely positioned at this point in time, kind of what he can do. And I guess what brings me some hope is the broader coalition of Arab nations that are intended to be involved in this. And I'm kind of wondering what your insight is on how critical their involvement is and kind of how reliable that involvement is going to be to get us to a future peace.
Well, they're vital for different reasons. Egypt is vital for security in Gaza. They actually understand. They have the border. They actually understand. They have security and intelligence. You're going to need Saudi and Emirati money to be invested very heavily in rebuilding Gaza. You're going to need, and they also want to make peace with Israel. I'll say in a minute what their condition is. And Qatar also to press Hamas. And along with Jordan, who's very influential in the West Bank. So all these actors are critical. What these countries want, especially the Gulf states at this point, is they have huge amounts of oil money. Their number one priority is turning that oil money into something long-term sustainable. Technology, AI, economy, green energy, all these things they're investing in, diversifying their economies. And before October 7th, they saw a deal with Israel that will also strengthen their ties with the United States as one of the best bets in doing that. What they've realized after October 7th is they can't bypass the Palestinian issue. They have to deal with that too, because for two reasons. One, if you think American teens have been radicalized by what they're seeing on social media is happening in Gaza, I can tell you that compares not at all to what in the Arab world is being seen by this next generation of kids who had also kind of started to put the Palestinian cause on the back burner. So they have their populations they have to deal with. But also, this war has led to all kind, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict resulted in war between Hezbollah and Israel, missiles flying between Israel and Iran, the Houthis cutting off access to the Red Sea, all these things. They're like, we cannot thrive and get the investment we need in this region if there's these wars going on. So their condition for getting in and doing this is peace with, is a pathway for Palestinian statehood. And for Israelis, this is so important because two things are true. There's a lot of skepticism in Israel about the Palestinian state. There is a huge desire by Israelis to be at peace with all of their Arab partners and to be fully integrated and accepted in the region. And so that's the carrot. That is the major carrot for Israeli society to actually to take the tough steps they need to take towards the Palestinians. And so that's how I think this is hopefully all going to work, if it works the way we'd like it to work. But the Arab states have also said, we're not investing all this money in Gaza just to have it all blown up again in a few years. And so unless we see a real pathway to sustainability, and that means a Palestinian state, and real governance and security in Gaza, we're not going to do it. And so we need Israel to step up and work with us on this.
Adam, last word.
I'll probably just grab this. Hi, everyone. I'm Adam Steinberg. I'm J Street's West Coast Director. I happen to live in Seattle, though, so I'm local. You just heard a conversation. I want to say thank you first to you two for having this conversation, for hosting this, for talking about heady issues. Thank you to Her Sinai and Congregation Beth Shalom and Kavanah and Kol Ami for co-sponsoring. These two talked about a lot of things that feel a lot beyond our control. I'm sure that there's a lot that we're thinking about and hedging our bets on for the future. We don't know how it's going to turn out. One of the things we do have control over as American Jews here is what our government does, how our government represents us. So if you feel like you align with some of the things you heard from my colleague Ilan, if you're interested in our approach to these issues, I encourage you to find out more about J Street if you don't already. We do local advocacy and national advocacy if you want to be involved in our advocacy efforts. We have QR codes to sign up or talk to me after this. But if you could only there's many ways to get involved in J Street, but if you could only do one thing, if you want to hear more conversations like this, from more speakers from the region, from the US, if you want to take one action in the next 6 months, I might want to encourage you to consider coming to Washington, D.C., February 28th through March 23rd, where we're going to be holding, March 3rd, excuse me, it's a 4-day conference, 4 days, not an entire month, for our national convention, which will be the largest pro-Israel, pro-peace, pro-democracy gathering in the U.S. In the next year. We have information outside. It is during Purim, so I apologize to Her Sinai. If you have permission to not come to the Purim celebration here, we will also have a Megillah reading and a Purim commemoration at the convention. So I encourage you to consider coming, and thank you all for being curious and for being here tonight.
Thank you to Ilan. Thank you, J Street. Thank you to all of you. Have a wonderful evening. I'm sure Ilan will have some opportunity to talk with you about things that you didn't get a chance to ask. So thank you.
What's your name? Eugene. Eugene. Yeah. Thank you for coming. Yeah, absolutely. Where do you live? Right in Bellevue, so not too far. Like we actually.